Warning, before delving into the meat of this video, I'm going to delve into some introductory setup to tee it up properly. But if you desire to cut the bullshit and jump straight into the deep end, well, that's what the timestamps are for. In anticipation of the upcoming Superman movie, and due to the amazing reception toward my outline video for a personalized blueprint of a DC cinematic universe concept from the ground up, I decided to post yet another outline for the first theoretical project in said cinematic universe, Superboy. Just as James Gunn kicked off his own concept with a fun little 7-episode Creature Commandos HBO Max original series to introduce his universe's tone and whet the fans' appetites while finishing up the debut movie of the franchise, I would begin my own with an 8-episode introductory Superboy season. Whereas Creature Commandos didn't end up being terribly consequential to Gunn's universe's overall mythology, I chose a Superboy project to kick off mine as a more relevant lead-in to my theoretical debut Superman movie. Though I wrote this forthcoming pitch to completely stand on its own and in no way be mandatory viewing to understand or comprehend the upcoming alternative Superman pitch. It will, however, enhance understanding of some of the characters and motivations, preview certain elements that will reappear within this universe's future projects, and lay backstories and lore for all those interested. But without further ado, let's dive into the first episode. Episode 1 would open with a flashback showing farmers Jonathan and Martha Kent driving home from the hospital. Jonathan would struggle to comfort his despondent wife, and through the former's dialogue, it would be inferred that Martha had recently suffered yet another miscarriage. Eventually, she would numbly wonder if they simply weren't meant to be parents, but before Jonathan could respond, a meteor would crash down, narrowly missing their truck. They would look up to see a full-blown meteor shower and would rush to safety. Once the coast would be clear, the couple would survey the damage, stumbling upon a spaceship when doing so, which they would come to theorize arrived amongst the meteors. The top of the craft would recede to reveal an unconscious infant within. The opening credits would then begin. After the credits, now within the present, Clark would be early on into his sophomore year of high school, already exhibiting super strength and speed, enhanced durability, and the ability to leap great distances. He would initially be shown interacting with his adoptive parents, Jonathan and Martha, over breakfast, showcasing their family dynamic. Clark would be an ultra-dutiful and respectful son, while Martha would serve as the emotional heart, and Jonathan would be the blunt guiding force, often passing down morals and offering advice. This scene would be swiftly interrupted by a car horn outside their farmhouse. Clark would walk outside to find his childhood friend Pete Ross excited to drive them both to school in his new car. During the trip, Pete would joke in reference to Clark's powers, confirming that he is one of the select few aware of them. As they would ride through town, missing posters of a couple children would briefly be seen. Once on campus, they would be confronted by head jock Whitney Ford and his best friend Brad Wilson, who would proceed to make fun of them, emasculating Pete about his car in front of the other surrounding students. Clark's expression would twist in anger, but Pete would subtly convey for him to calm down, accepting the continuing harassment so as to ensure his best friend would refrain from making a drastic mistake. The harassment would cease when school heartthrob and Whitney's girlfriend, Lana Lang, would arrive at school, as the two bullies would excitedly greet her. As the school day would continue, demonstrating Clark's dynamics with yet more of his supporting cast, both fellow students and school faculty members alike, he would eventually find himself in Smallville High's newsroom, typing out an article for the online newspaper, glazing the school's football team and hyping up their chances during the approaching season. Switching perspectives, there would be a brief scene between Whitney and Lana, delving into some dynamics of their relationship. During this exchange, it would be shown that Lana is uncomfortable with how high a priority football is to Whitney, even seeming to prioritize it above their relationship, and also make remarks about not finding the other members of the team to be a terribly good influence on him. This would grate on Whitney, who would defend his teammates, but also reinforce his love for her. Lana would tell him directly that he's a good person, despite his tough exterior, and to never lose sight of that. Back within the newsroom, Chloe Sullivan, de facto editor-in-chief of the publication, would enter and hunch over Clark's shoulder, reading aloud his latest sentence, showering praise onto Whitney's quarterbacking skills, and would tease her good friend and colleague over his integrity to give praise where praise is due, even if the recipient makes his day-to-day miserable and is dating the girl of his dreams. Clark would retort with a nugget of wisdom Jonathan imparted to him throughout the years about being the better man and objectivity. Just then, they would hear a commotion outside the room and exit to see lesser members of the football team assaulting a nerdy student as Brad would enthusiastically egg them on from the sidelines, laughing. Clark would immediately jump into the fray in defense of the bullying victim. Though he would succeed in breaking up the violence, he would be forced to hesitantly sell getting shoved backwards when a flailing attack would inch toward him. The bullies would then turn their attention toward Clark, but after the timely arrival of school staff, they would quickly disperse. This scene would end shortly after Clark and Chloe would help the humiliated and enraged victim to his feet before he would dramatically run off down the halls. After school, Clark would grouse to his parents about being different than his peers at school, relating the incident to them and saying that he had the power to put the bullies in their place, but had to instead allow himself to be humiliated, always needing to appear weak. Jonathan would respond that it takes greater strength to know you have unmatched advantages, yet sacrifice the praise and glory from those around you for the sake of everyone's safety. Clark would solemnly excuse himself to go off to his room, while Jonathan and Martha would exchange a telling look to one another. At night, Clark would casually write in a journal, narrating his words through an audible inner monologue, expressing his anguish over having to sacrifice his reputation and jealousy over Lana being head over heels in love with a jerk like Whitney, while failing to give him the time of day. Clark would lament that the toughest thing to deal with was simply the lack of answers regarding himself. Some days later, Pete would be shown excitedly approaching Clark after yet another school day, thrusting a pamphlet into his face, advertising freak football tryouts. He would explain that a handful of members of the football team got benched for some number of the initial games of the approaching season, heavily hinted to be the result of pressure from a PSA written by Chloe within the school newspaper, reporting on the previous beatdown they engaged in. Pete would then attempt to persuade Clark to join him in trying out to improve their social standing within the school. Though obviously intrigued, Clark would remain hesitant due to his unfair advantage, but Pete would simply tell him that his powers would be his surefire guarantee onto the team and to tap into them just enough to outdo the veteran players. Clark would respond that even if he wanted to join, his parents would never allow it. Pete would tell Clark to imagine the girls they'd be able to pull as football stars, even bringing up Lana, causing Clark to express a subtle delight. Clark would find the opportunity to broach the subject sometime later to Jonathan during a commercial break of a college football game they would be watching together. Jonathan would unsurprisingly forbid his son from attending the tryouts, frustrating the latter, who would have a meltdown lamenting how unfair it is that due to being born with powers outside his control, he's forbidden from a normal life. He would claim his parents to have always been overprotective and never trusting him to rein in his powers to remain incognito, despite him having kept them under wraps thus far. The escalation of Clark's frustrations would cause Martha to enter the room to help calm things down. Though she would sympathize with Clark's plight, she would implore him to truly take Jonathan's concerns on the matter into consideration. After an exchange of glances with his wife, Jonathan would tell Clark to follow him down to their farm's storm cellar, which Clark had previously been persuaded never to enter through a convincing cover story. Within the cellar, Jonathan would unveil Clark's spaceship and recap the boys' arrival on Earth. Though Jonathan would have limited information, he would stress to Clark that he and Martha would have determined over the years that he was a gift from God with a grand destiny to help steer the planet in a positive direction. To that end, Jonathan would claim that he and Martha have done their best to instill in him the morality, compassion, and knowledge needed to accomplish this, viewing doing so as their own destinies. After a prolonged silence, Clark would react to the revelation with fear, confusion, and anger, accusing his father of having no right to keep any of this from him over the years. He would propose that his arrival on Earth explains why he's always been such a freak and an outsider, and would exclaim that he isn't a gift from God, but instead a sick and twisted joke. After one final stinging accusation toward Jonathan for commandeering his life as a way to feel more important himself, Clark would speed off. A brief scene would show Martha exiting a phone call to inform Jonathan that Clark is staying overnight at Pete's house. Jonathan would frustratedly critique his words when revealing to Clark the truth about himself, though Martha would comfort him, insisting that the boy would simply need time to digest the revelations. Another flashback would be shown, taking place immediately after the previous one. As Jonathan and Martha would approach the infant Clark, the ship encompassing him's scanners would be alerted to their presence, and a humanoid hologram would project from a certain component of the craft. The hologram would introduce himself as Jor-El and claim that he is from a planet within a neighboring galaxy called Krypton. Jor-El would explain that he is now deceased, along with his entire planet, only able to save his son Kal-El before suffering his tragic fate. He would beseech the Kents of Earth to welcome and love Kal-El as if he was their own before the holographic projection would cease. Though Jonathan would express hesitance and caution with interacting with the ship and child within, Martha would venture closer. The infant would wake up and start to cry, so Martha would absent-mindedly scoop him out of the ship and rock him back and forth. She would say that they can't call him Kal-El, naming him Clark after her father instead. She would further insist to Jonathan that it was them who found the boy for a reason, and that they could provide the boy love that the authorities wouldn't. Seeing his wife happily beaming, Jonathan would tell her to set Clark in the truck so she could help him load the ship into the back. Back in the present, Clark would attend the football tryouts alongside Pete, both shown to be competent at the sport. Seeing Lana in the stands, Clark would start showing off to the point Pete would have to remind him to rein it in yet again. The coach would be impressed by them both, considering the school's action toward the team to have been a blessing in disguise. Though Whitney would attempt to undercut Clark, the coach would wave him off. Suddenly, the victim of the football team's previous beatdown would stride out onto the field, dressed in conspicuous baggy black clothing. Though Whitney would make sarcastic comments at the notion of the kid being there for the tryouts, Brad would actively harass the latter up close, blaming him for the current state of the football team just before the start of the season. The victim would then pull a handgun out of his waistband and point it at Brad, crying as he would do so. Brad would back off toward the bulk of the team, arms up in submission, insisting that all the torment inflicted upon the outsider would have been nothing but jokes. From the stands, Lana would hysterically persuade one of her friends to run off and get help, as she herself would audibly worry for Whitney's safety, with tears rolling down her cheeks. Clark would look around at everyone's terrified expressions, hesitant while deciding how best to handle the situation. The football coach would issue threats of repercussion onto the bullying victim, but this would result in him getting shot non-fatally in the shoulder. This action would prompt Clark to carefully walk toward the boy, subtly talking him down by relating to his feelings of being an outcast and the subject of torment by the members of the football team. There would be a tense moment, but ultimately Clark would successfully defuse the situation, much to everyone's relief. Later, the authorities would arrest the bullying victim, while paramedics would attend to the football coach. During this, the majority of the football team, with the exception of Whitney, would thank Clark and give him and Pete their blessing to join the team with open arms. Lana would briefly leave Whitney's side to thank Clark for saving the day, which obviously would make Whitney uncomfortable, before the coach would come over and officially offer Clark and Pete a place on the team. After looking at Lana returning to Whitney, Clark would join in Pete's enthusiasm, both boys graciously accepting. Clark would return to his own home that night, greeted by his parents. He would present his football jersey and declare that he joined the football team despite their wishes, wanting to experience the pleasures that normal people his age get to take part in. Though Jonathan and Martha would express their disappointment in his decision, they would confirm their support for him. Martha would bid him to be careful not to harm anyone on the field, and Jonathan would add for Clark to be careful of showing off in the heat of the moment. Clark would promise to follow their advice and would thank them for their supportiveness. Both parents would confirm their trust in him, but insist his powers add a level of complexity in his life. They would say that someday they would hope to see him use his powers more responsibly, not just for personal gain. Clark would acknowledge their words, but claim that feeling the camaraderie and the exhilaration of a sport for the first time in his life would simply be something he needs to experience. In a final flashback set a day or so after the previous two, Jonathan would be shown at a bar having a beer with his buddy Ben Hubbard. Having apparently confided Clark's mysterious origins with Ben, Jonathan would express trepidations with raising the child, thinking someone with more experience would be a better fit for the task. Ben would challenge Jonathan's fears, convincing him to empathize with Clark, an infant alone in the potentially terrifying and often bigoted world. He would claim that Jonathan and Martha are actually the most ideal couple in the world to raise such a child. Jonathan would arrive home sometime later and hesitantly call for Martha. She would come into the room beaming and coddling Clark, and seeing this, Jonathan would be touched. He would address the boy as their son for the first time, declaring that it's about time to introduce him to the rest of the town. Returning to the present to close out the episode, Clark would be seen again writing in his journal, expressing excitement toward the prospect of taking the reins of his life, but would also note how much he loves his parents and is thankful for their guidance. Though he would admit that he must make certain independent decisions for himself, he would do so with the knowledge and wisdom imparted to him by them. Clark would begin another thought, but would be shown obviously distracted. Putting his pen down, he would look out his window and stare at the entrance to the storm cellar. And after a moment, he would be shown exiting the farmhouse to enter it. Clark would cautiously approach his ship, but upon getting too close, its scanners would detect his presence, just as they had with Jonathan and Martha in an earlier flashback. This time, instead of the ship projecting a full hologram of Jor-El, it would instead only project his voice, greeting Clark as his son Kal-El, and informing the latter that it's past time for him to learn of his heritage and understand the circumstances that led up to his arrival on Earth. A stream of light would project from the ship straight onto Clark's face. He would appear to be in an unblinking trance. The camera would then maneuver to a close-up shot of one of Clark's eyes as his pupils would reflect rapid-fire images of Kryptonian symbols. The credits would then abruptly commence. After the credits, an additional scene would occur with a young child staring out a window of his or her home while their parents would be heard arguing in another room. Suddenly, a toy soldier would appear in his vantage, marching down the sidewalk outside. The child would proceed to sneak out of the house and chase down the toy, but as they would reach down to grasp it, the soldier would turn toward him or her and shoot a gas pellet at them from its gun. The child would stumble backward, but before they would collapse on the pavement, an unknown individual dressed in black would exit an unmarked van parked nearby and catch the former before loading them into said van, with the toy soldier following after. So there you have it. This is the complete vision I have for the initial episode of an 8-episode, 2-season Superboy live-action series leading into a Superman theatrical film. Smallville, the Man of Steel comic series, Superman for All Seasons, Year 1, American Alien, and Secret Origin were all used for research into this project. Smallville, as many of you probably noticed, was a heavy inspiration for this episode in particular, as it contains an amazingly realistic take on Clark's initial realization of his origins. But I can promise you all that the subsequent episodes of this series will veer farther and farther away. But as stated previously, ideas from many other Superman origin stories, along with beats from my own imagination, were also infused into this episode as well. A big aspect of my pitch is the emphasis of Clark's relationship with the written word. Aside from his work for the school newspaper, I also had the idea of depicting him frequently journaling, and the importance of this will increase as this series goes on, leading to him ultimately joining the Daily Planet during his adult years. I want to show him inevitably deciding to use his passion for writing to oppose crime and corruption that can't be punched or attacked, exposing it as the humble Clark Kent, alongside fellow staff members of the planet, such as Lois and Jimmy. One final thing I wanted to mention is that amongst the animals on the Kent farm, Clark would be particularly close to a horse named Comet. Comet, in the comics, is a super horse with a convoluted backstory. My version, at least for the time being, would be a normal horse. It's just meant to be an interesting deep-cut homage to the comics. I love animals, and you can bet that most, if not all, of the mainstay super pets will be featured in one way or another at some point during this theoretical shared universe. So tell me your feedback. Bear in mind that you gotta let me cook to some extent, as this video is only 1/8 of a larger story, but I'm always down to hear your comments. Also, like and subscribe if you'd be so kind. I'm a one-man show here, and would love to get to the point I can generate videos weekly or even daily. Lastly, click on the top video that just popped up to see the larger blueprint for the overall shared universe I seek to craft, starting with this pitch, or the video below it to see my fan-favorite rewrite pitch reworking Batman Forever. Thank you all for watching to the end of the video. Ciao, Pisanos.